November 29, 1944. The waters south of Japan lie black and still under a moonless sky. Beneath the surface, the ocean currents run cold, indifferent to the war raging across the Pacific. In these depths something moves. Not the natural rhythm of whales or the drift of tide, but the deliberate, calculated movement of predator and prey. 70,000 tons of armored steel cuts through the darkness above. The Shinano. The largest aircraft carrier ever constructed by human hands. 872 feet of what the Imperial Japanese Navy believed was engineering perfection. Her hull, thicker than any carrier before her, was designed to laugh at torpedoes. Her flight deck, vast enough to land entire squadrons, stretched into the night like a floating airfield. Every rivet, every weld, every plate of armor represented Japan's defiant answer to defeat. She was supposed to be invincible. Below her, in the crushing pressure of the deep, another vessel tracks her movement. The USS Archerfish. A single American submarine. Barely 300 feet long. A fraction of the carrier's mass. Yet in this moment size means nothing. In the ocean's darkness, the advantage belongs to the unseen, the patient, the silent. Commander Joseph Enright peers through the periscope, his eye pressed against the cold rubber eyepiece. He sees the silhouette. Massive. Moving fast. Zigzagging in evasive patterns. He's never seen anything like it. Too large for a battleship. Too fast for a transport. His pulse quickens but his hands remain steady. His crew crowds the control room, barely breathing, waiting for orders that will either make history or send them to the bottom. Neither crew knows it yet, but in the next few minutes the entire calculus of naval warfare will shift. This encounter will become legend. A single moment when patience defeated power. When silence shattered steel. When the largest moving target in the Pacific became the largest submarine kill in history. This is not a story about technology alone. It's about hubris. About the assumption that size and armor can guarantee survival. About the fatal distance between what engineers promise and what the ocean delivers. About how 17 hours at sea can erase 4 years of construction and centuries of naval tradition. The Shinano's story begins not with her launch, but with the disaster that made her necessary. To understand how she ended up here, exposed and vulnerable in hostile waters, we must go back to the moment Japan's carrier fleet died in a single day. June 4, 1942. The Battle of Midway. In 6 minutes, American dive bombers turned the tide of the Pacific War. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, burned and sank. With them went Japan's offensive capability, her most experienced pilots, and the illusion of invincibility that had carried her from Pearl Harbor to the edges of Australia. The Imperial Navy reeled. These weren't just ships. They were symbols. The steel embodiment of Japan's rise as a Pacific power. Their loss left a psychological wound that strategy alone couldn't heal. Japanese admirals understood the mathematics of industrial warfare. America could build carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from them. The production gap was unbridgeable through conventional means. So they chose symbolism over strategy. They decided to build something so massive, so powerful, so undeniably superior that its mere existence would restore confidence and intimidate enemies. They would create the largest carrier the world had ever seen. Enter the Shinano project. Originally, she had been laid down as the 3rd Yamato-class battleship. Her keel was identical to her sisters, the Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever constructed. 72,000 tons of displacement. 18-inch guns that could hurl shells the weight of small cars over 25 miles. But by 1942, the era of the battleship was ending, even if Japan's admirals refused to fully accept it. Carriers ruled the Pacific now. Aircraft could strike far beyond the range of guns. The decision was made in secret. Shinano's construction would pivot. She would become a carrier, but not like any carrier before her. She would retain the Yamato's armor, the thick belt of steel designed to shrug off battleship shells. She would become a support carrier, a floating base capable of refueling, rearming, and repairing aircraft for the rest of the fleet. A mobile fortress that could operate far from Japan's shrinking defensive perimeter. The numbers were staggering. 70,000 tons fully loaded. A flight deck measuring over 800 feet. Armor plating 16 inches thick in critical areas. 47 aircraft in her hangar with capacity for more on deck. Fuel tanks large enough to supply entire carrier divisions. Machine shops capable of overhauling engines. Storage for thousands of bombs and torpedoes. Japanese engineers poured their expertise into her design. They studied every carrier loss, every torpedo hit, every fire that had consumed hangar decks. They added redundant pumping systems, subdivided compartments, installed the latest damage control equipment. They calculated that Shinano could survive a dozen torpedo hits and still make port under her own power. But beneath the technical specifications lay a dangerous assumption. The belief that complexity plus size equals invincibility. That armor can substitute for readiness. That engineering brilliance can overcome strategic reality. Japanese shipyards were running out of skilled workers. American submarines controlled the shipping lanes, strangling the flow of raw materials. Every month of construction saw Japan's industrial capacity shrink further. Yet Shinano continued to grow. She became more than a ship. She became a statement. A declaration that Japan could still produce wonders, still match American industrial might, still turn the war's momentum. Her construction was classified at the highest levels. Even within the Navy, only essential personnel knew her true dimensions. Photographs were forbidden. Workers signed secrecy oaths under threat of imprisonment. By 1944, reality was collapsing around the project. American forces had retaken the Philippines. B-29 bombers were beginning to reach the Japanese mainland. The combined fleet had been shattered at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan's remaining carriers sat in port, grounded by fuel shortages and pilot losses. And still, Shinano sat in her dry dock at Yokosuka, growing larger, consuming resources Japan no longer had, representing a vision of naval power that belonged to a war already lost. Her very existence had become an act of denial. A refusal to accept that the ocean's rules had changed, and that in the new age of naval warfare, the greatest threat didn't come from above the waves or on the surface. It came from below, silent and patient, waiting in the dark. To understand how the world's largest carrier sank so quickly, you must first understand what made her supposedly unsinkable. The Shinano wasn't just big. She was a floating fortress designed with every lesson learned from. Japan's carrier losses burned into her blueprints. Her armor belt measured 8 inches thick at the waterline, tapering to 6 inches above. No American carrier could claim even half that protection. Her flight deck, unlike the wooden decks of earlier carriers, was armored with 3.5 inches of steel plate. Bombs that would penetrate and devastate American carriers would, in theory, bounce off Shinano's deck or detonate harmlessly above her hangar. Below the waterline, her designers had created what they believed was a masterpiece of survivability. The hull was divided into hundreds of watertight compartments, each capable of being sealed independently. Pumping stations were distributed throughout the ship, with multiple redundancies. Even if several compartments flooded, the theory went, the others would keep her afloat. Her role as a support carrier shaped every design choice. Unlike fleet carriers that needed to launch and recover aircraft rapidly, Shinano was built to sustain operations over extended campaigns. Her fuel bunkers could hold enough aviation gas to supply multiple carriers for weeks. Her magazines were designed to store thousands of bombs, torpedoes, and ammunition of every caliber. Her machine shops contained lathes, welding equipment, and spare parts for every aircraft type in the Japanese inventory. She carried 47 aircraft in her hangars, but her true value wasn't in her own air wing. She was designed to be the fleet's mobile repair facility, the ship that would keep Japan's remaining carriers operational far from home ports. In an empire whose defensive perimeter was collapsing inward, Shinano represented the ability to project power despite shrinking territory. Her engineering plant was equally impressive. 12 boilers fed 4 steam turbines, generating 150,000 horsepower. Despite her massive displacement, she could make 27 knots, faster than most battleships. Her range exceeded 10,000 nautical miles. She could cross the Pacific and back without refueling. Every system had a backup. Every critical space had alternate access routes. Her fire suppression systems were the most advanced Japan had ever installed. Carbon dioxide flooding systems could smother fires in the hangar deck within seconds. Sprinkler systems covered every passageway. Firefighting equipment was distributed to dozens of stations throughout the ship. On paper, she was nearly perfect. Japanese engineers had taken every painful lesson from Midway, from Coral Sea, from the Philippine Sea, and built a ship that could survive what had killed her predecessors. The calculations were sound. The materials were the best available. The construction techniques represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval architecture. But perfection on paper assumes perfect execution. It assumes trained crews who know every system intimately. It assumes completed construction with every seal tested, every door verified, every pump exercised under load. It assumes time for shakedown cruises, for identifying weaknesses, for correcting the thousand small issues that emerge when theory meets saltwater. Shinano would have none of these advantages. Her designers had created a ship that could survive anything, assuming she was finished. Assuming her crew was trained. Assuming her systems were tested and proven. Remove those assumptions and the fortress becomes a liability. The very complexity that made her theoretically invincible would become the mechanism of her death. Because in November 1944, with American bombers photographing Yokosuka Naval Yard and Japanese admirals growing desperate, someone made a decision that doomed her before she ever left port. Someone decided that Shinano, unfinished and untested, had to sail immediately. By late November 1944, Tokyo burned regularly. American B-29 superfortresses reached the Japanese mainland with increasing frequency, and their reconnaissance cameras captured everything. Yokosuka Naval Yard appeared in dozens of photographs, and intelligence analysts could clearly see the massive hull of Shinano in her construction dock. This terrified the Japanese naval staff. The ship represented too much investment, too much strategic value, too much symbolic importance to risk losing before she ever moved. Yet she was still far from complete. Walking her decks was like touring a construction site that happened to float. Welding equipment lay scattered across passageways. Electrical cables hung loose from overhead. The smell of fresh paint and cutting torch smoke filled every space. The watertight integrity that her designers had calculated so carefully existed only in theory. Hundreds of the watertight doors were newly installed, their seals untested under pressure. Many compartments still lacked proper sealing altogether. Pipes ran through spaces where bulkheads should have provided separation. Workers had cut temporary access holes that were supposed to be sealed later. Later never came. Her pumping systems, the critical defense against flooding, had never been exercised as a complete system. Individual pumps worked in isolation, but the complex network of valves, switches, and power distribution that would allow damage control teams to fight flooding across multiple compartments remained untested. Many of the pump operators were dockyard workers, not trained sailors. They knew how to install equipment. They had no idea how to use it in an emergency. The crew situation was equally dire. Shinano's design called for 2,500 sailors, trained specialists who understood every system aboard. Instead, she sailed with roughly 2,400 people, and perhaps a third of them were actual Navy personnel assigned to the ship. The rest were yard workers, civilian technicians, and raw recruits who had never been to sea. Many were still installing equipment as the ship prepared to sail. Captain Toshio Abe, a capable and experienced officer, had been given command just weeks earlier. He barely knew his own ship. He'd conducted no training exercises, no damage control drills, no emergency procedures. His officers were similarly unfamiliar with their stations. The ship was so new that organizational charts were still being drawn up. Yet the order came down from Naval General Staff. Shinano must sail to Kure Naval Base, roughly 300 nautical miles southwest. At Kure, away from the immediate threat of American bombers, she could complete her fitting out in relative safety. The risk of sailing incomplete, the admirals decided, was less than the risk of staying in Yokosuka. Captain Abe objected. He documented the ship's unreadiness in writing. He noted the incomplete watertight integrity, the untrained crew, the untested systems. His concerns were acknowledged and dismissed. The decision was made at levels far above his authority. Shinano would sail on November 28, under cover of darkness, with a 3-destroyer escort. At 6 o'clock in the evening, the massive carrier eased away from her fitting-out pier. Tugboats nudged her bulk into the channel. As she cleared the harbor breakwater, her engines increased to 20 knots. The plan was simple. Steam south along the coast, maintain high speed through the most dangerous waters, reach Kure by dawn. The 3 escorting destroyers, Isokes, Hamakes, and Yukikes, formed a loose screen around her. These were experienced ships with veteran crews, but they hadn't trained with Shinano. They didn't know her maximum speed, her turning characteristics, her communication procedures. They were 3 individual ships guarding a carrier they'd met hours earlier. Standard doctrine called for anti-submarine zigzagging, random course changes that made it difficult for submarines to establish firing solutions. Shinano zigzagged, but her size made every turn a ponderous affair. At 70,000 tons, she couldn't snap through direction changes like smaller carriers. Her turns were long, predictable arcs that any experienced submarine commander could plot with a stopwatch and basic geometry. Below decks, workers continued their installations even as the ship moved. Welders worked by portable lights. Electricians ran cables through passageways crowded with stored equipment. In the boiler rooms, crews struggled with unfamiliar systems. In damage control stations, sailors tried to understand equipment they'd never trained on. The ocean south of Tokyo Bay was not Japanese water anymore. American submarines had been operating there for months, intercepting military traffic, sinking cargo ships, hunting for major targets. The Navy knew this. Every ship that sailed these approaches accepted the risk. Shinano sailed anyway, incomplete and vulnerable, the largest moving target in the Pacific, into waters she no longer controlled. Aboard her, officers reassured themselves with the ship's specifications. She could survive multiple torpedo hits. She was armored beyond any carrier afloat. The risk, they told themselves, was acceptable. 400 miles to the south, Commander Joseph Enright was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. Commander Joseph Francis Enright carried failure like a weight in his chest. Months earlier, while commanding the USS Archerfish on a previous patrol, he'd had a major Japanese warship in his crosshairs. A perfect setup. Ideal firing position. But something held him back. Caution or doubt or the paralysis that sometimes grips officers when the stakes are absolute. He didn't fire. The target escaped. The decision haunted him. In submarine warfare, opportunities like that came rarely. The Pacific was vast, and Japanese warships increasingly stayed in port, conserving fuel, avoiding the submarine-infested waters between their shrinking empire and the home islands. Enright had let one slip away. His superiors didn't relieve him, but he felt the weight of their disappointment. Submarine commanders were judged by results. Tonnage sunk. Ships destroyed. Bold attacks that succeeded. Caution was necessary for survival, but excessive caution meant empty patrol reports and wasted opportunities. Enright knew he'd been too careful. He needed redemption. So when Archerfish departed Pearl Harbor for another patrol in November 1944, Enright carried a silent determination. Next time he would not hesitate. Next time he would trust his instincts and take the shot. The war was entering its final phase. American forces were closing on the Japanese home islands. Opportunities would only decrease as the remaining Japanese fleet huddled in harbors, saving fuel for a final defense that everyone knew was coming. Archerfish was a Below-class submarine, the workhouse of America's Pacific submarine campaign. 311 feet long, displacing just over 2,000 tons surfaced. She carried 24 torpedoes and a crew of 80 men. Not impressive numbers compared to the capital ships she hunted, but in the submarine's natural environment, beneath the waves, size meant nothing. Her crew was experienced. They'd completed multiple patrols together, developed the rhythms and communication shortcuts that keep submarines alive in hostile waters. They trusted Enright, despite his previous hesitation. They knew he was competent, careful, and hungry for a significant kill. The patrol area assigned to Archerfish was the approaches to Tokyo Bay, some of the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. Close to Japan's naval bases, the area was heavily patrolled by destroyers and aircraft. But it was also where the targets were. Any major warship leaving Yokosuka or Yokohama had to pass through these waters. For a patient submarine commander, it was prime hunting ground. By November 28, Archerfish had been on station for several days without contact. The ocean was empty. Radio intercepts suggested Japanese naval activity, but nothing had appeared on their radar or through their periscope. Enright maintained patrol depth during daylight, surfaced at night to recharge batteries and scan the horizon with radar. At 8:15 in the evening, the radar operator called out a contact. Distant. Large. Moving fast. The bearing suggested it was coming from Tokyo Bay, heading southwest along the coast. Enright ordered Archerfish to periscope depth and turn to intercept. What happened next required judgment that decades of training and experience couldn't fully prepare an officer for. The contact was moving at 20 knots, zigzagging in a pattern that suggested military discipline. It was too large to be a transport, too fast to be a tanker. Through the periscope, in the dim moonlight, Enright caught his first glimpse. A massive silhouette. Larger than anything he'd encountered. A flat top that stretched impossibly long. Destroyers flanking it in escort positions. This was no ordinary target. This was a capital ship, possibly the largest he would ever see. Enright faced a choice. He could report the contact in shadow at a distance, letting other submarines know a major target was in the area. Or he could attack. Alone. Against a target that was faster than his submerged speed, escorted by destroyers, zigzagging unpredictably through waters he didn't fully know. This time there was no hesitation. He would attack. He would close to torpedo range. He would take the shot. Whatever haunted him from his previous patrol would end tonight, one way or another. He gave the order to pursue. The chase began immediately. Archerfish ran on the surface, diesel engines pushing her to maximum speed, trying to get ahead of the target's projected course. But the massive ship was making 20 knots, and submarines on the surface struggled to maintain that pace. Enright couldn't simply follow. He had to predict, to anticipate the zigzag pattern, to position his submarine where the target would be, not where it currently was. The control room became a cramped laboratory of calculation. The executive officer plotted bearings on the navigation table. The quartermaster tracked time intervals between course changes. The radar operator called out ranges and bearings every few minutes. Enright absorbed the data, building a mental model of the target's behavior. Japanese zigzag patterns weren't random. They followed doctrine, regular intervals and turn angles that allowed escort destroyers to maintain formation. If Enright could identify the pattern, he could predict the next turn and position Archerfish in the target's path. But if he guessed wrong, the target would slip past and there would be no second chance. For an hour, Archerfish ran on the surface trying to close the distance. The target's silhouette grew gradually larger, but not fast enough. Enright made the decision to dive ahead of the target's track, hoping it would run over his position. If the timing was wrong, he'd be too far away for an effective shot. If it was right, he'd have the perfect angle. At 9:45, Archerfish submerged. The sudden silence after hours of diesel roar was profound. Now they moved on battery power alone, slower, quieter, listening through the submarine's sonar for the approaching target. Time compressed in the darkness of the control room. Red lighting preserved night vision. Men whispered instead of speaking normally. The sound came first. The throb of massive screws, the cavitation of propellers pushing enormous displacement through water. Then the hydrophone operator refined the bearing. The target was approaching but not directly overhead. Enright adjusted course slightly, trying to maintain position in the target's path. At 10:20, Enright raised the periscope for 5 seconds. A dangerous move. The periscope's wake could be spotted by alert lookouts, especially in calm seas. But he needed visual confirmation. What he saw made his breath catch. The target was huge. Unmistakably a carrier. The flight deck stretched endlessly. This was the largest ship he'd ever seen through a periscope. He lowered the scope immediately and made his decision. He would shadow the target for hours if necessary, waiting for the perfect firing position. There would be no rash attack, no wasted torpedoes. He would be patient, methodical, and when he struck, it would be decisive. The next 5 hours tested the crew's endurance. Submarines are hot. 80 men generate body heat in a confined space with limited ventilation. Carbon dioxide builds up gradually, making men drowsy and sluggish. The temperature climbed past 90 degrees. Sailors stripped to their waists, sweating freely, trying to remain alert. Enright rotated periscope observations every 30 minutes. Brief glimpses, never more than a few seconds, just enough to verify the target's position and course. Each time the massive carrier appeared, sometimes showing her starboard side, sometimes stern on, sometimes nearly bow on. The destroyers wove complex patterns around her, but they weren't conducting aggressive anti-submarine searches. They seemed focused on maintaining station. The target's zigzag pattern became clear after several hours of observation. She was turning approximately every 20 minutes, alternating between port and starboard turns of roughly 30 degrees. The pattern wasn't perfectly regular, but close enough to predict. Enright could work with this. By 2 in the morning, Archerfish had maintained contact for over 5 hours. Exhaustion was setting in, but so was confidence. Enright understood the target's behavior now. He knew her speed, her turning characteristics, the timing of her escorts. He was no longer chasing. He was positioning for the kill. Then, at 3:15 in the morning, the target made a turn that exposed her starboard side to Archerfish's bow. The angle was nearly perfect. Range approximately 1,400 yards. No destroyers between the submarine and the carrier. The solution was clean. Enright's voice was calm, almost conversational. Make ready all tubes. The crew had been waiting for this moment. Torpedo men verified the tubes were flooded and outer doors open. The fire control team fed final bearing and range into the targeting computer. In the control room, every man knew what was about to happen. Enright took one final look through the periscope. The carrier's hull filled the eyepiece, a wall of steel sliding across his field of view. He could see the flight deck, the island structure, the gun positions along the sides. This was real. This was happening. His hand moved to the firing lever. Stand by. The seconds stretched impossibly long. Then, quietly, firmly, he gave the order that would change history. Fire. The torpedoes left their tubes in sequence 6 seconds apart. A slight shudder ran through Archerfish's hull with each launch. The submarine immediately became lighter, buoyancy shifting as 6 tons of weapons and compressed air departed. The diving officer adjusted trim to compensate, adding water to ballast tanks to maintain depth. In the torpedo room, men closed the inner tube doors and began the process of reloading, though no one expected to need more shots. 6 Mark 14 torpedoes were running toward the target, each carrying 650 pounds of Torpex explosive. At a range of less than 1,500 yards, they would reach the target in approximately 45 seconds. Enright kept the periscope raised, watching. Dangerous but necessary. He needed to observe the impact to confirm the hit, to provide accurate data for his patrol report. The carrier continued her turn, completely unaware that death was racing toward her starboard side at 46 knots. The first explosion came at exactly 47 seconds. A massive gout of water rose alongside the carrier's hull, followed immediately by a second, then a third and fourth. 4 hits. Enright saw them clearly, the white columns of spray, the orange flashes of detonation, the shudder that ran through the massive ship's structure. 2 torpedoes had missed, running ahead or behind the target. But 4 had struck home, hitting below the waterline where the armor belt was thinnest, punching through steel into the spaces where boilers, fuel tanks, and machinery lived. Down periscope. Dive deep. Right full rudder. Enright's orders came rapidly now. Every destroyer within 10 miles would be racing toward the attack position. Sonar pinging, depth charges ready. Archerfish had to disappear immediately before the counterattack began. The submarine nosed downward, passing through 200 feet, then 300. The hull groaned under increasing pressure. Men listened intently, waiting for the sound of approaching destroyers, the high-speed screws that would signal incoming depth charges. Nothing came. No pursuing destroyers, no depth charges, no sonar pings searching for them in the depths. The ocean around Archerfish remained eerily quiet. Through the hull, transmitted through the water, they could hear distant explosions. Secondary detonations. The target was dying. Enright allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 4 hits on a major target. Possibly a carrier, possibly something even larger. This was redemption. This erased his previous hesitation. Whatever haunted him from earlier patrols was gone now, replaced by the certainty that he'd done his job, done it perfectly, and given his country a victory that would be remembered. The crew remained silent, professional, but the tension in the control room had shifted to something approaching elation. They'd struck the largest target any of them had ever seen. They'd done it perfectly, getting into position, firing at the ideal moment, and escaping without counterattack. This was what submarine warfare was supposed to be. Archerfish continued deep, running silent, putting distance between herself and the attack site. Behind her, on the surface, the largest aircraft carrier ever built was flooding from 4 massive holes below her waterline. Her crew scrambled to save her, but they were already too late. The damage was catastrophic, irreversible, and absolutely fatal. Shinano had 17 hours left to live. The first torpedo struck Shinano's starboard side at frame 31, just forward of amidships. The explosion tore a hole roughly 30 feet across, opening 3 adjacent compartments to the sea. Water pressure at that depth was enormous. The ocean didn't seep in. It blasted through, a solid column of seawater moving with the force of a fire hose. The second torpedo hit near frame 47, breaching 2 boiler rooms and a fuel storage space. Superheated steam exploded from ruptured boiler tubes, killing the men on watch instantly. Fuel oil mixed with seawater, creating a toxic, flammable slush that spread through connecting passages. The third and fourth torpedoes struck almost simultaneously, hitting frames 62 and 71. These opened the ship's vitals to the ocean. Generator rooms flooded. Pump stations went dark. The careful redundancy that designers had built into Shinano meant nothing if the electric power to run the pumps was gone. Captain Abe felt the detonations from his position on the bridge. 4 distinct shocks, each accompanied by the sound of tearing metal and the vibration that runs through a dying ship. His first thought was damage assessment. His second was disbelief. For torpedoes? The designers had promised Shinano could survive a dozen. Surely 4 hits couldn't be fatal. He was wrong on almost every level, but his confidence in the ship's design would prevent him from accepting reality until it was far too late. Below decks, chaos spread faster than any damage control party could contain it. The ship's internal communication system, never fully tested, failed almost immediately. Telephone lines went dead as seawater reached junction boxes. Messenger runners tried to bring reports from flooding compartments, but many passages were already blocked by rising water or secured by automatic watertight doors. The few damage control teams that did reach the flooded spaces found themselves helpless. The pumps that should have been their primary weapon against flooding wouldn't start. Some had no electrical power. Others had power but frozen mechanisms because they'd never been properly broken in. A few worked, but their capacity was a fraction of what was needed. In the starboard boiler rooms the scene was apocalyptic. Water rose rapidly in the dark, lit only by failing emergency lighting. Sailors struggled through waist-deep water, trying to secure valves, trying to reach escape ladders before the compartments completely flooded. Many didn't make it. The watertight doors, newly installed and unfamiliar to the crew, didn't seal properly. Water flowed through gaps around the gaskets, through improperly aligned frames, through the dozens of small openings that shouldn't have existed but did because the ship had never been properly tested. Captain Abe made his first critical error in judgment 30 minutes after the attack. Believing the ship could survive if they reached shallow water near the coast, he ordered full speed ahead. The logic seemed sound. Get to shoal water where even if the ship settled to the bottom, the upper decks would remain above the surface. The crew could be saved and possibly the ship could be patched and refloated. But speed forced water through the torpedo holes with even greater pressure. The flooding that might have been contained at lower speeds became catastrophic at 20 knots. Water surged from compartment to compartment, overwhelming the inadequate watertight integrity, spreading through the ship's guts like a disease. By 4:30 in the morning, Shinano had developed a 5-degree list to starboard. Not immediately dangerous but concerning. Damage control reports were contradictory and incomplete. Some said the flooding was under control. Others reported worsening conditions. Abe, lacking clear information and trusting in the ship's designed resilience, continued toward the coast at high speed. The list increased. 5 degrees became 8, then 10. Simple tasks became difficult. Walking across a deck tilted at 10 degrees required constant adjustment. Equipment slid across compartments. Men had to brace themselves just to stand. Still, Abe refused to consider abandoning ship. Shinano was designed to survive this. The list would stabilize. The pumps would catch up. They just needed to reach shallow water. By 5:30 in the morning, the list had reached 15 degrees. Officers on the bridge could no longer deny the severity of the situation. The ship was visibly lower in the water on the starboard side. Sailors crowded the port side of the flight deck, instinctively moving away from the list, their weight ironically making the situation worse. The escort destroyers circled nervously, their commanders watching the carrier settle deeper into the ocean. They offered to attempt towing, to pass pumps, to render any assistance possible. Abe accepted, ordering the destroyers to come alongside and pass tow lines. But when they attempted to tow, the cables snapped almost immediately. 70,000 tons moving through water creates enormous resistance. The destroyer's engines couldn't overcome it. Daylight came at 6:15. For the first time, the crew could see the full extent of their predicament. The starboard edge of the flight deck was noticeably closer to the water than the port side. The ship's wake was asymmetric, curving to starboard. Oil and debris trailed behind them, marking their path across the ocean. At 7 o'clock, with the list past 18 degrees, Captain Abe finally accepted what everyone else had already concluded. Shinano was dying. She was going to sink and there was nothing anyone could do to save her. The only question remaining was whether they could save the crew. The order to abandon ship came too late. At 10:18 in the morning, with the list exceeding 25 degrees, Captain Abe finally gave the command everyone had been dreading. All hands prepare to abandon ship. But preparation required time that no longer existed. Sailors crowded the port side of the flight deck, now elevated high above the water while the starboard side dipped toward the ocean. Life preservers were distributed, though there weren't enough for everyone. Lifeboats had been positioned wrong during construction, most on the starboard side now submerged or unreachable. The destroyers maneuvered close, trying to take men directly off the deck, but the carrier's increasing list made approach dangerous. Men jumped from the flight deck into the ocean, a fall of 40 feet that increased to 60 as the ship rolled further. Some hit the water cleanly. Others struck debris, pieces of the ship breaking loose as she rolled. The ocean was cold, shocking after the warmth of the ship's interior. Oil covered the surface, choking men who surfaced gasping for air. Below decks, hundreds remained trapped. Watertight doors that should have opened were jammed by the ship's distortion. Passages tilted at impossible angles became untraversable. Emergency lighting failed throughout the ship, leaving compartments in absolute darkness as water rose. The exact number of men trapped below would never be known with certainty. At 10:57 in the morning, Shinano reached her breaking point. The list passed 30 degrees, then 35. The massive hull shuddered, metal screaming as structural members exceeded their design limits. Then she rolled completely, her flight deck perpendicular to the ocean surface, her starboard side fully submerged, her keel exposed to the sky. She hung there for perhaps 15 seconds, balanced on the edge of physics, thousands of tons of steel defying gravity through sheer momentum. Then she began to slide. Not slowly. Not gradually. Once the roll began, it accelerated. The bow dipped, the stern rose, and the largest aircraft carrier ever built slid beneath the surface stern first. The ocean closed over her in less than a minute. From the perspective of the destroyers, it looked almost gentle. One moment, a massive hull dominated the horizon. The next, empty ocean. The waves continued as if nothing had happened. The water showed no sign that 70,000 tons of steel had just vanished beneath it. The suction of the sinking ship pulled debris and men downward. Survivors fought to swim away from the vortex, their life preservers keeping them afloat but doing nothing to prevent the pull. Some were dragged under and never resurfaced. Others managed to clear the danger zone and floated, exhausted, waiting for rescue. Of approximately 2,400 people aboard Shinano when she sailed from Yokosuka, only 1,080 were recovered alive. 1,120 people died. Most went down with the ship, trapped below decks or pulled under by the sinking. Captain Toshio Abe was among them, choosing to remain on the bridge as his command slipped beneath the waves. Shinano had been at sea for exactly 17 hours. In Tokyo, the news hit Naval General Staff like a physical blow. The largest carrier ever built, sunk by a submarine before completing her first voyage. The psychological impact was devastating, but the strategic implications were worse. Shinano represented years of labor, thousands of tons of increasingly scarce materials, and the concentrated expertise of Japan's best naval architects. All gone. All wasted. All for nothing. The immediate response was denial. Surely the reports were exaggerated. Surely the ship was damaged but salvageable. When confirmation arrived that Shinano had completely sunk with over 1,000 casualties, denial transformed into something more dangerous. The decision to suppress all information. Within hours the orders went out. Every survivor was individually briefed. They were forbidden to discuss the sinking with anyone, even family members, under threat of court-martial and imprisonment. Officers were threatened with worse if they spoke. The survivors were dispersed to different units, separated to prevent them from talking among themselves. Official records were altered or destroyed. Shinano's name was removed from fleet rosters as if she'd never existed. The handful of photographs taken during her construction were classified at the highest levels. Even within the Navy, officers who weren't directly involved in the Shinano project were told nothing. Inquiries were met with silence or misdirection. The reasoning was coldly logical. Japan's situation was already desperate. American forces controlled the Pacific. The homeland faced regular bombing. The population's morale was fragile. To admit that the Navy's most ambitious project had been destroyed in a single night, sunk before firing a shot, before launching a single aircraft, would shatter what remained of confidence in Japanese military capability. Better to pretend Shinano never existed. Better to let the American submarine think it had sunk something else. Better to bury the failure so completely that even decades later, when survivors wanted to tell their stories, they would find their own memories dismissed as fantasy. The families of the dead were given vague explanations. Lost at sea. Died in service to the emperor. No details. No closure. The 1,120 men who went down with Shinano became ghosts, their deaths unacknowledged, their sacrifice unmarked by any public memorial. Within the Imperial Navy, the sinking triggered bitter debates that remained secret for decades. How had security failed so completely? American submarines shouldn't have known Shinano's location or timing. Had there been a spy? Had communications been intercepted? Or was it simply cruel luck that a submarine happened to be exactly where Shinano needed to pass? The truth, that it was nothing more than Commander Enright maintaining patrol position in the right waters at the right time, was too mundane to accept. Conspiracies were invented. Blame was assigned. But none of it changed the reality that Japan's largest carrier was gone, and the thousands of hours and millions of yen invested in her had purchased nothing except a reminder that size and armor no longer guaranteed survival. For the rest of the war, Shinano remained a secret. The public would not learn of her existence until American occupation forces accessed Japanese naval records after the surrender. Even then, many details remained classified for years. The full story emerged slowly, reluctantly, as survivors finally felt safe enough to speak and researchers pieced together fragments from both sides. Aboard Archerfish, the mood was celebratory but cautious. Commander Enright drafted his patrol report with care, describing the attack on what he believed was a large carrier. He estimated the target's displacement at approximately 28,000 tons, roughly the size of Japan's remaining fleet carriers. This was already an exceptional kill. The largest target Archerfish had ever engaged. He had no idea what he'd actually sunk. Without aerial photography, without surface observation, submarine commanders could only estimate targets based on brief periscope observations, often at night at ranges where details were difficult to discern. Enright knew the target was large. He knew it was a carrier. Beyond that, he could only guess. When Archerfish returned to Pearl Harbor in December, Enright submitted his report to the submarine command. The initial response was enthusiasm. A confirmed carrier sinking, possibly the Hayataka or one of Japan's conversion carriers. Well done. Medals would be awarded. The crew would be recognized. Then came the analysis. Intelligence officers reviewed Enright's description. The estimated size didn't match any known Japanese carrier. The location was odd. Why would a major carrier be sailing alone with minimal escort? The timeline was questioned. Some analysts suggested the target might have been a large transport, not a carrier at all. Enright's claim was downgraded. Instead of a confirmed carrier, his kill was listed as probable, possibly a converted carrier or large auxiliary. Still significant, but not the major victory he'd believed. The crew's disappointment was profound. They knew what they'd hit. They'd heard the secondary explosions. They'd observed the target through the periscope. But without Japanese confirmation, their kill remained disputed. The truth wouldn't emerge until after the war. When occupation forces accessed Imperial Japanese Navy records, they found references to a massive carrier named Shinano, 70,000 tons. Sunk by submarine on November 29, 1944. Location matched. Timeline matched. The description matched. Enright had sunk not a fleet carrier, but the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine. His 4 torpedoes had accomplished what he couldn't have imagined. The target he'd estimated at 28,000 tons was actually more than double that. The patrol he thought had earned him redemption had actually made history. The Navy revised his citation. Commander Enright received the Navy Cross, and Archerfish received a Presidential Unit citation. In the submarine community, the sinking of Shinano became legend. The perfect patrol. The patient stalk. The clean attack. The escape without counterattack. It represented submarine warfare at its finest. Yet even with official confirmation, some doubt lingered for years. The sinking seemed too perfect, too one-sided. How could a submarine sink the world's largest carrier with 4 torpedoes? The answer lay not in Archerfish's exceptional capability, but in Shinano's exceptional vulnerability. A completed, trained, properly prepared ship might have survived Enright's attack. The Shinano that sailed from Yokosuka never had a chance. Shinano's destruction marked more than the loss of a ship. It signaled the death of an entire philosophy of naval warfare. For centuries, navies had competed in building larger, more heavily armored vessels. The assumption was straightforward. Bigger meant stronger, and stronger meant safer. Battleships grew from 10,000 tons to 70,000. Armor increased from inches to feet. Guns reached ranges measured in miles. But the ocean's rules had changed. Size no longer guaranteed survival. Armor couldn't protect against threats that struck from below or above. The age of the capital ship, the era when massive visible power dominated the seas, was ending. Shinano was its last gasp, and her death in 17 hours demonstrated exactly why that age was over. The submarine that killed her displaced 3% of her tonnage. Archerfish carried no armor. Her weapons were torpedoes, not guns. Her advantage was invisibility, not strength. She won through patience, precision, and positioning, not through overwhelming force. This represented the future of naval warfare. Smaller, more mobile, more technological platforms would dominate the oceans, not the massive monuments to industrial capacity that had defined naval power for generations. Aircraft carriers survived the war, but they evolved. The carriers that would define the Cold War and beyond looked nothing like Shinano. They abandoned heavy armor in favor of speed and air defense. They relied on screening ships for protection, not their own hulls. They understood that survivability came from not being hit, not from absorbing hits. Shinano's designers had tried to create a carrier that could take punishment. Modern carrier doctrine focused on avoiding punishment entirely. The lessons extended beyond ship design. Shinano's sinking demonstrated the fatal dangers of hubris in engineering. The belief that complex systems could compensate for incomplete preparation. The assumption that specifications on paper translated to capability at sea. The confidence that size and armor rendered training and testing less important. Japanese engineers had created a theoretical masterpiece. They'd calculated every contingency, designed redundancies for every system, built protections against every known threat. But theory requires perfect execution and perfection requires time. Time to complete construction properly. Time to train crews thoroughly. Time to test systems under realistic conditions. Shinano sailed without any of these advantages and paid the ultimate price. The human cost of that hubris was 1,120 lives. Sailors who died in flooded compartments. Workers who went down with a ship they'd been installing equipment on hours earlier. Young recruits who'd barely learned their stations before being called to abandon ship. Captain Abe who trusted his ship's engineering until it was too late to save anyone. For decades after the war, Shinano remained largely unknown outside naval history circles. No monument marked her sinking. No public ceremony honored her dead. The survivors who finally told their stories found themselves explaining a ship most people had never heard of. In Japan, Shinano became a symbol of wartime mistakes, spoken about quietly if at all. In America, Archerfish's achievement was recognized but never celebrated as loudly as surface victories like Midway or Leyte Gulf. Yet among naval architects, submarine commanders and military historians, Shinano's story carried profound meaning. It became a case study in what happens when desperation overrides prudence. When symbolic value outweighs practical readiness. When faith in engineering replaces respect for the ocean's indifference to human plans. Commander Enright's reflection captured the strange nature of his victory. He'd sunk the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine, and didn't even know its name until the war ended. No photographs showed Shinano underway. No combat footage captured her final moments. She existed in records and memories, a ghost ship that disappeared almost before she appeared. In the end, silence won. The silent submarine defeated the massive carrier. The silent ocean swallowed 70,000 tons of steel without trace. And silent orders from Tokyo erased the disaster from public knowledge for years. Shinano's legacy is written in absence, in what she could have been if properly completed, properly prepared, properly respected. She was meant to restore Japanese pride. Instead, she proved that pride without preparation is fatal, and that in the ocean's depths, physics cares nothing for symbolism. The age of the super ship ended in 17 hours, on a morning in November, in waters that belonged to no one.